The mansion was silent, save for the deafening echoes of the gunshot that had shattered the night. Vincenzo the King Romano, the feared leader of the Mafia syndicate, had just fallen, his life extinguished in the blink of an eye. Blood pooled on the cold marble floor as his body slumped, lifeless, against the wall. Amid the chaos, a bloodied hand, belonging to Salvatore Romano, Vincenzo's son, reached for the phone, trembling but determined. The screen lit up, casting a soft glow on the darkened room. With a shaky breath, the final message was typed. "It's done. The king is dead." A sense of finality hung in the air as the camera lingered on Salvatore's hand that had once held power, now reduced to a grim symbol of betrayal. But whose hand was it? And who would rise from the ashes of this criminal empire? The camera panned out, leaving only the unanswered questions hanging in the atmosphere. The world had shifted. Nothing would ever be the same. The room was filled with the cold bite of silence, the echo of the gunshot still hanging in the air. Salvatore Romano stood, frozen, staring at the message on the phone screen. "It's done. The king is dead." His heart raced, a mixture of guilt and satisfaction coursing through his veins. The act had been necessary, but the weight of what it meant began to settle in. His father, Vincenzo Romano, the head of their empire, was dead. And now, the empire was his to control. Or was it? Salvatore looked down at his hands, his thoughts clouded by what had just transpired. Blood, betrayal, and power had come together in that single moment. But with his father's death, a vacuum had been created. Was he prepared to take on the legacy that came with it? The room around him was still, yet in his mind, a storm raged. He didn't know if he could trust anyone now, not even himself. But he had to push forward, for the sake of the family. The consequences of his actions would follow him forever, but there was no turning back. The empire awaited. Salvatore Romano paced back and forth, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and anger. His father was dead, killed in an instant without warning. Yet it wasn't the shock of his death that haunted him. It was the betrayal. The person who had orchestrated this wasn't just an outsider or a rival. No, it was Salvatore's own flesh and blood, his sibling Marco Romano. His brother, the one person he thought he could trust, had betrayed their father, their family, for a power that could never satisfy him. Salvatore's fists clenched at his sides, fury building within him. How could Marco have done this? The answer was simple. Greed. Power. The desire to control a dynasty. But now, Salvatore was left with the consequences of that betrayal. His own brother had thrown their legacy into chaos. The family he had sworn to protect was in jeopardy, and no one was left untouched by this web of lies and manipulation. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, steady and deliberate. Salvatore Romano turned to face the figure who had entered the room. Marco Romano, his brother. There was no warmth in his gaze, no brotherly affection, only coldness. Marco, standing tall and confident, smiled. But it wasn't a genuine smile. It was the smile of someone who had already claimed victory, someone who thought they were untouchable. "You are here," Salvatore said, his voice low and strained. "To take what's mine." Marco didn't flinch. "You're too weak for this, Salvatore. Always have been," he responded coolly. "The family needs a new leader, a stronger one." Salvatore's heart raced. His brother had betrayed them both, and now he was coming for the throne. The fight was inevitable, but this was no ordinary fight. It was a battle for the soul of their family, and Salvatore wasn't sure if he was ready to confront his own flesh and blood. The confrontation between the two brothers left Salvatore shaken. Marco Romano had made his intentions clear. He was taking control of the family. Salvatore didn't know if he could stop him. Power, the wealth, the empire, it was all slipping away. For a moment, Salvatore thought about walking away, leaving it all behind. But then he thought of their father, of the blood and the legacy, the empire they had built together. It was too much to abandon. But could he fight his own brother, the one person who had been his closest confidant? His mind raced as the choice loomed before him: stand with the family, or watch it all burn to the ground. The consequences of that decision would haunt him forever. But in that moment, he made his choice. He would fight. For the family. For the empire. But most of all, for redemption. The cold air in the city's underbelly was thick with tension. Salvatore Romano stood in front of a small, dimly lit cafe. The kind of place where secrets were exchanged. His mind was racing. His brother, Marco Romano, had not only seized control of the empire, but had also turned the family's closest allies against him. Every move seemed calculated to push Salvatore out, to break him. But there was one person he could still trust: Giovanni Bianchi, a former rival who had once crossed paths with the Romano family. Now Giovanni had become an unlikely ally. As they sat across from each other, exchanging glances full of hidden meaning, Salvatore could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. If he wanted to take back control of the empire, he would need to strike at Marco's weakest points. But first, he needed to know everything Giovanni had on the syndicate's secret dealings. Giovanni leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know things that will ruin Marco for good." Salvatore Romano's mind raced as Giovanni Bianchi revealed more and more secrets about Marco Romano's shady dealings. Every word Giovanni spoke felt like a nail in the coffin of his brother's empire. Salvatore's thoughts began to spiral into a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. He had trusted Marco, shared everything with him. But now, his brother's lust for power had driven him to betray everything they had built together. Salvatore's breath grew shallow, and he fought to suppress the fury building inside him. He wanted revenge, wanted to destroy everything Marco had created. But he needed to stay calm. "If you want to take him down, you need more than just a few whispers in the dark," Giovanni said, his voice low. But the weight of his words was clear. Salvatore nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." By the time the meeting was over, Salvatore Romano felt the heavy burden of the choices ahead. The intel Giovanni had provided would give him leverage against Marco Romano. But the risks were high. There were still many players involved, some of whom had already sworn loyalty to his brother. Salvatore knew the only way to topple Marco was to infiltrate his inner circle, but doing so meant risking his life. As he left the cafe, his thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, yet strained. "Salvatore, it's time." "We move tomorrow night," the voice said. Salvatore didn't hesitate. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end for Marco Romano. The following evening, Salvatore Romano stood in the shadows, overlooking the abandoned warehouse where Marco Romano had been meeting with his allies. The air was thick with anticipation. Salvatore had already planned his next move. He had infiltrated the syndicate's operations, gaining enough trust to be invited to this secret meeting. Tonight, he would finally have the chance to confront Marco. As he adjusted his jacket, a familiar face appeared from the darkness: Lucia Moretti, a trusted ally of Marco Romano. She had been loyal to Vincenzo Romano before his death, but with Marco's rise to power, she had become a wild card. "You know what you're walking into, don't you?" she asked. Salvatore nodded, his jaw clenched. "I have no choice," he replied. He wasn't just fighting for the empire now, he was fighting for his soul. As the clock struck midnight, Salvatore Romano and Lucia Moretti walked into the meeting room, where Marco Romano awaited. The room was filled with members of his inner circle, powerful figures who had pledged loyalty to his cause. Salvatore couldn't help but notice the cold, calculating look in Marco's eyes as he greeted him. "I didn't think you had the guts to show up, Salvatore," Marco sneered. Salvatore felt the anger rising in him, but he kept his composure. "You've crossed a line, Marco. This family, this empire, it's not yours to destroy," he said, his voice steady. Marco chuckled. "It was always mine. You were just too blind to see it." In that moment, Salvatore knew that there was no going back. This wasn't just a fight for the empire, it was a battle for survival. The tension in the air was palpable as Salvatore Romano paced back and forth in his private office, his mind consumed by the ever-spiraling conflict with his brother Marco Romano. The power struggle had escalated quickly, and the moment of confrontation was fast approaching. Every decision he made was a delicate calculation, a single wrong move, and the entire empire could slip from his grasp. His family's legacy, the blood-soaked empire that had ruled for decades, was at stake. Salvatore had once been loyal to his brother, but trust had been shattered, and now he had to fight for control. Marco's actions were becoming more erratic and dangerous. With each passing day, Salvatore could feel the walls closing in. Marco was not the same man anymore. Greed had consumed him, pushing him to make alliances with those who could destroy the very fabric of their family. Salvatore needed leverage, and fast. He had to strike before Marco could make his move. But who could he trust? In the midst of betrayal and lies, Salvatore knew that only one thing was certain: this would end in blood. The morning sun crept through the blinds, casting thin slivers of light onto the cold, polished floor of Salvatore Romano's meeting room. Today was the day everything would change. He had arranged a clandestine meeting with Lucia Moretti, one of the few allies still loyal to him. Lucia, though once aligned with Marco, had seen the darker side of his rise to power, and now saw the truth. As Salvatore sat across from her, the silence between them was filled with the weight of what they were about to discuss. Lucia leaned in, her voice hushed but urgent. "There's a plan, Salvatore. We have a window of opportunity, but it won't last long." Her eyes glinted with determination as she spoke. Salvatore knew that Lucia wasn't just talking about the empire. She was talking about survival. If they didn't act now, everything would be lost. He nodded, his jaw clenched. "Tell me what we need to do." The time for subtlety was over. Salvatore Romano and Lucia Moretti had prepared their move. They had gathered intel on Marco Romano's operations, the corrupt officials, the illegal deals, and the men he trusted. But there was one key person still missing: Giovanni Bianchi. Giovanni had once been a powerful ally in their father's empire, but after Vincenzo Romano's death, he had distanced himself, becoming a rogue figure operating in the shadows. Salvatore knew that if they were going to have any chance of toppling Marco, they needed Giovanni's help. But trust was a fragile thing, and Giovanni's loyalties were unclear. As Salvatore made his way to meet him, his mind swirled with doubt. Was this the right move? Could they trust Giovanni, or was he just another potential enemy in the making? There was no turning back now. The game had shifted, and now, every move counted. Inside the dimly lit warehouse, Giovanni Bianchi stood at the far end, his hands in his pockets as he watched Salvatore Romano and Lucia Moretti enter. The air was thick with anticipation, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the silence. Giovanni's face was unreadable, his eyes sharp but calculating. "I didn't think I'd see the day when the Romano boys came crawling to me," he said, his voice rough with disinterest. Salvatore stepped forward, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of tension. "You've always known where the power lies, Giovanni. We need your help, and you need ours." The two men locked eyes, the weight of years of betrayal and unspoken history hanging between them. Giovanni sighed, and after a long pause, nodded slowly. "What's your play, Salvatore? I'm in, but I want to know the full plan." With Giovanni Bianchi now on their side, Salvatore Romano felt a new surge of confidence. The pieces were falling into place. They had the intel, the allies, and the will to fight. Marco Romano was no longer untouchable. But there was still one final hurdle: the inner circle. Marco had surrounded himself with people who had no loyalty, no honor. Salvatore would have to break them one by one. The plan was set. The night of the final strike was approaching. But as Salvatore looked around the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Was this all just a power grab, or was there something more at play? Marco's rise to power had been swift, and with every step, the web of corruption had grown thicker. Salvatore's hands were tied, but he would not stop. Not until he had his empire back, and his brother, Marco, where he belonged. The air in Salvatore Romano's private study felt dense, charged with the weight of impending action. The plan was in motion. Giovanni Bianchi, now fully aligned with Salvatore, had delivered critical information that would allow them to strike at Marco Romano's inner circle. Yet, Salvatore knew that the path ahead would not be without sacrifice. His mind kept returning to the same question: could he really trust Giovanni? The lines between ally and adversary had blurred so many times throughout his life. Despite everything, Salvatore felt an unease that gnawed at him. There was always the possibility of betrayal. Lucia Moretti stepped forward, her face steady, but her eyes revealing the same quiet apprehension. "It's now or never, Salvatore. We do this tonight, or we lose everything," she said, her voice calm but firm. Salvatore nodded, feeling the gravity of her words. There was no room for error. The final confrontation with Marco was upon them. The moment had arrived. The sound of the car engine hummed softly as Salvatore Romano, Lucia Moretti, and Giovanni Bianchi drove through the darkened streets toward Marco Romano's estate. Salvatore couldn't shake the feeling of finality in the air. Tonight, everything would be decided. He looked over at Giovanni, who was seated across from him, his face stoic, unreadable. They had both played this game before, but now the stakes were higher than ever. If they failed, not only would Marco remain in control of the family, but Salvatore could lose everything: his father's empire, his legacy, and perhaps his own life. Lucia remained silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, clearly aware of the danger they were about to face. As they neared the estate, the imposing silhouette of Marco's mansion loomed in the distance. Salvatore's heart pounded as he thought about the confrontation that awaited them inside. One way or another, this would end with blood. They arrived at Marco Romano's mansion just before dawn, the massive structure standing like a fortress in the fading darkness. Salvatore Romano took a deep breath as he stepped out of the car. The weight of his family's history, the bloodshed, and the betrayals hung heavy on his shoulders. This was the final moment, and it could all fall apart in an instant. Giovanni Bianchi gave him a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. "This is it, Salvatore. You know what to do," Giovanni said, his voice low. Salvatore nodded, but remained silent. They moved swiftly toward the mansion's entrance. Lucia Moretti took point, her movements sharp and precise, a silent assurance that she was ready for whatever lay ahead. As the massive iron doors of the estate creaked open, they were met with the sight of Marco Romano's loyalists, armed and waiting. Salvatore stepped forward, eyes locked with Marco's men. The battle for the family's future was about to begin. Inside the mansion, Marco Romano awaited them in the grand hall. The room was massive, with towering columns and antique furniture, but its grandeur did little to mask the tension in the air. Salvatore stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Marco's. "So, you've finally come," Marco said, his voice cold and confident. "You should have stayed away, brother. This family was never meant for you." Salvatore clenched his fists at his sides, but kept his voice steady. "This family was always meant for both of us, Marco. But you took it from me, from all of us." Marco smirked, his arrogance evident. "What do you think you can do, Salvatore? You've already lost." Salvatore took a step forward, his heart pounding but his resolve solidified. "I haven't lost yet." And then, the first shots were fired. The battle for control of the Romano Empire had begun. The gunfire echoed through the mansion, the sharp sounds of betrayal and violence filling the air. Salvatore Romano felt the adrenaline surge through his veins as the chaos unfolded around him. His men, now in full force, clashed with Marco Romano's loyalists in a brutal exchange. The once proud house of the Romano family was now a battlefield. Salvatore and Marco were locked in a final deadly standoff. Salvatore lunged, his fist connecting with his brother's jaw, sending Marco stumbling back. Blood dripped from Salvatore's lip, but he didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was the end. The fight raged on, and as Salvatore looked into his brother's eyes, he realized that Marco was no longer the man he had once called family. There was no saving him. With a final push, Salvatore took control, but the cost of victory was clear. The Romano Empire would never be the same again. The mansion was a wreck, a battlefield. Salvatore Romano stood amidst the carnage, the blood of both his men and Marco Romano's loyalists, staining the marble floors. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder, the sharp metallic scent of blood mingling with the fading echoes of violence. The Romano family empire, which had once stood proud and unyielding, now lay in ruins. But Salvatore knew that this was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. Marco was dead, but his legacy of betrayal and bloodshed had already taken root. As Salvatore looked over the wreckage of his family's home, he wondered if this would ever feel like a victory. Was the cost of redemption too high? The power he had fought for had come with a price he had not fully understood until now. Lucia Moretti approached, her face hard with the same resolve that had carried them through this battle. "It's done, Salvatore. Now we rebuild. But don't forget, Marco is only one part of a much bigger machine," she said. Salvatore nodded slowly. The fight wasn't over, but the foundation had been laid. And this time, there would be no more room for betrayal. As dawn broke, casting the mansion in a new uncertain light, Salvatore Romano stood on the balcony, overlooking the city. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Marco Romano was dead, but the power vacuum left in his wake would draw in predators from every corner of the underworld. Salvatore's mind raced. Who could he trust now? Who was still loyal to him? The betrayal had run so deep within the family that the line between ally and enemy had blurred. Lucia Moretti joined him on the balcony, her eyes scanning the city below. "You've won, Salvatore. But you know as well as I do that this city doesn't forgive easily," she said, her voice low and steady. Salvatore turned to face her, his gaze hard. "I'll make them see that I'm not Marco. I'll rebuild this empire from the ground up, and this time, I won't make the same mistakes." But deep down, Salvatore knew that the road ahead would be filled with more blood, more betrayal, and more sacrifices than he could ever have imagined. Weeks had passed since the battle for control of the Romano Empire, but the aftershocks of Marco Romano's death were still being felt. Salvatore Romano had taken his place as the head of the family, but the power struggle was far from over. Rival families had started to test his leadership, and every decision he made was scrutinized. Trust was a rare commodity, and as much as Salvatore wanted to believe that his allies were true, he knew that many were waiting for a sign of weakness. The underworld was a vicious, unforgiving place. Giovanni Bianchi had become a key player in the new regime, but Salvatore couldn't shake the suspicion that his old ally was hiding something. And then, as if on cue, a new threat emerged. Lucia Moretti had been approached by someone from her past, someone who had the power to undermine everything they had built. As Salvatore paced the halls of his new headquarters, he realized that the true battle for the empire was only just beginning. And this time, there would be no room for mistakes. The tension between Salvatore Romano and Giovanni Bianchi had reached a breaking point. Salvatore had always respected Giovanni as a man of honor, but the last few weeks had shown him that loyalty was an even rarer commodity than he had realized. Giovanni, once an ally, had become a figure of suspicion. Salvatore had received intel that Giovanni had been making deals with a rival syndicate, deals that could potentially destroy everything they had fought for. As Salvatore confronted Giovanni in his private office, the air was thick with tension. "What's going on, Giovanni?" "I trusted you," Salvatore said, his voice cold and controlled. Giovanni met his gaze, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "You trusted the wrong people, Salvatore. You never knew who was really in control," he replied. The room was silent for a moment before Salvatore made his move. There was no room for betrayal. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. As the dust settled and Salvatore Romano finally took full control of the family empire, he realized that victory had come at an even greater cost than he had imagined. The betrayals had been numerous, and the trust he had once placed in his family had been shattered beyond repair. Marco Romano was gone, but his influence still lingered, casting a long shadow over everything Salvatore tried to rebuild. The family was broken, the empire fractured. Salvatore knew that he would never fully escape the ghosts of the past. And yet, as he looked at the wreckage of his once immaculate home, and the war-torn remnants of the Romano legacy, Salvatore understood one thing clearly. He had become what he had always feared. He had inherited the very darkness he had sought to escape. But there was no going back. The empire was his now, and he would rule it as ruthlessly as it had always been ruled, with blood and fire. The walls of Salvatore Romano's new stronghold felt colder than ever. The city had become a place of war, and each decision carried weight. Despite taking control, the relentless pressure of maintaining power weighed heavily on him. Rival families were testing him, and whispers of betrayal filled the air. The shadows of the past, his brother's treachery, his father's legacy, seemed to haunt him at every turn. Salvatore knew the empire would only survive if he remained ruthless. But inside, he felt the toll of it all. The underworld had started to close in on Salvatore Romano. Despite his strategic wins, there were cracks in his empire. Giovanni Bianchi had started to show signs of discontent, and Lucia Moretti seemed increasingly distant. Salvatore knew that to preserve his power, he had to confront these growing threats. The city was on the verge of full-blown chaos, and he needed to strike fast before any more betrayals took root. The ghosts of the past and his brother Marco continued to haunt him. Salvatore Romano had reached the point where no one could be trusted. Giovanni Bianchi, who had once been a loyal ally, now seemed like a potential enemy. Rumors about Giovanni's dealings with other crime syndicates had reached Salvatore, and his suspicions grew. Salvatore knew he had to act quickly to confront Giovanni and sever any ties that might risk his control over the empire. The world he had inherited was one of constant paranoia and fear. No one was safe. The confrontation with Giovanni Bianchi was inevitable. As Salvatore Romano met Giovanni in a hidden location, the air was thick with tension. Giovanni didn't hide his smug expression, but the subtle flicker in his eyes betrayed a hint of fear. "I've given you everything," Salvatore said, his voice cold. "But I won't tolerate disloyalty anymore." Giovanni's smile faltered. "You think you've won, but this city doesn't belong to you, Salvatore. You can never escape what you are," he replied. Salvatore had only one choice now: end it. With Giovanni Bianchi now out of the picture, Salvatore Romano thought he could finally breathe. But the city's criminal underworld had one more card to play. Lucia Moretti had uncovered a plot to betray him, a well-orchestrated scheme by a rival syndicate that could destabilize his empire. Salvatore had no choice but to act swiftly and decisively. Lucia's warnings were clear. "The game's not over, Salvatore. They're coming for you." But this time, he was ready. He would destroy any enemy before they even had a chance to strike. The final confrontation was near. Salvatore Romano stood alone in his office, staring at the city beyond. The empire he had fought so hard for was within his grasp, but something was missing. The weight of power had left him hollow. Marco Romano was gone, but Salvatore knew that even in his death, Marco's influence still echoed through the city. The feeling of betrayal still lingered. Every decision he had made had led to this moment. As Salvatore took a deep breath, he understood that the only way forward was to destroy every remaining thread of his past. The price of power was not just the blood of his enemies, it was the blood of his soul. The call came unexpectedly. Lucia Moretti had uncovered the final piece of the puzzle, a hidden alliance between Salvatore Romano's closest allies and a powerful rival syndicate. This revelation shook him to his core. The people he had trusted most were the ones plotting against him. Salvatore had only one option: eliminate the threat before it consumed everything he had built. The walls were closing in, but he had no choice but to push forward. Lucia was by his side, her loyalty unwavering. Together, they would face the last battle for the empire. The final showdown was set. Salvatore Romano had tracked down the leaders of the rival syndicate, who had dared to betray him. The air was thick with anticipation as Salvatore prepared for the confrontation. His body was sore, his mind sharp. Lucia Moretti and Giovanni Bianchi stood by his side. The family was fractured, but together they would face the last remnants of the old world. The battle for control had reached its zenith, and there would be no more room for weakness. Salvatore had already sacrificed so much, but now, he was ready to burn everything down if necessary. The final confrontation had come. Salvatore Romano stood face to face with the rival syndicate's leader, a man who had plotted against him from the shadows. The standoff was brutal, as each word exchanged carried the weight of everything Salvatore had fought for. "You thought you could steal my empire, didn't you?" Salvatore growled. "But now you'll learn what it means to challenge me." The rival leader sneered, but Salvatore didn't hesitate. In a flash, the gunfire rang out, and when the smoke cleared, Salvatore stood victorious, but the cost was high. As dawn broke once again, Salvatore Romano stood alone in the wreckage of his victory. The syndicate had been brought down, and the traitors had been eliminated. But at what cost? Lucia Moretti stood beside him, watching the ruins of what was once the Romano Empire. "We did it, Salvatore," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it once had. Salvatore turned to her, his eyes hollow. "Did we?" he muttered. He had won, but the empire he had inherited was gone. The sacrifices had drained him. There was no going back. And now, he would rule in a world that was no longer his own.